The fluorescent lights in the community hall buzzed with a low, headache-inducing hum, the kind that vibrates in your teeth after a while. It was the night of the annual winter talent show, a chaotic, cheerful mess of a tradition that brought everyone in town out of their houses for a few hours. Usually, the air smelled of cheap coffee and floor wax, but tonight, there was a sharp tang of cruelty hanging near the back of the stage, unnoticed by almost everyone. A small group of musicians, 3 men and a woman who had been playing together since high school, were huddled in the wings. They were the unofficial royalty of the local scene. They had the expensive instruments, the flashy outfits, and the confidence that comes from knowing everyone likes you. Tonight, however, they were bored. They felt they had seen it all before, and they were looking for something to spice up the evening. Their target was a woman named Maria. Maria was not a musician, at least not in the way the town recognized. She was the quiet, sturdy woman who cleaned the rehearsal hall every Tuesday and Thursday night. She was somewhere in her 50s, with hair that she pulled back into a tight, practical bun and hands that were red and rough from years of scrubbing floors and lifting heavy trash bags. She usually moved through the building like a ghost, efficiently mopping around the feet of the real artists, rarely speaking unless spoken to. But for the last month, things had been different. People had noticed that after she finished mopping the stage, she would linger. She would sit at the grand piano in the center of the room, the one that was strictly off limits to everyone but the instructors, and she would hover her fingers over the keys. She never pressed them down. She just watched her hands, moving them silently, her lips moving slightly as if she were counting. She was preparing. She had finally worked up the nerve to sign up for the talent show, a fact that the backstage gossip mill had circulated instantly. The musicians in the wing thought this was the funniest thing they had heard in years. To them, music was a club they belonged to, and Maria was just the janitor. The idea of her sitting on that pristine stage, trying to play alongside them, felt like an insult to their art. "She's serious, you know," the guitarist whispered, nudging the drummer with his elbow and grinning. "I saw her practicing on a tabletop in the break room yesterday. She thinks she's got it?" "We can't let that happen," the bass player chimed in, keeping her voice low but full of nasty excitement. "It's going to be painful to watch. It's going to throw off the whole vibe of the night. We need to teach her a lesson about knowing your place." They hatched their plan quickly. It didn't take long because their goal wasn't complex, they just wanted to humiliate her. They knew that the old, battered upright piano, the one that had been replaced by the new grand model years ago, was still sitting in a dusty storage room down the hallway. It was a wreck. The humidity in the storage room had warped the soundboard, and years of neglect had rusted the strings. Half the keys stuck when you pressed them, and the other ones made a sound like a dying cat. It took them 20 minutes to wrestle the heavy, ugly instrument out of storage and onto a rolling cart. They grunted and sweated, snickering the whole time, treating the task like a heist. They managed to swap it for the grand piano just minutes before the show started, pushing the good piano out of sight and dragging the broken one into the center spotlight. It looked pathetic up there. The finish was peeling off the sides in long, curly strips, revealing the cheap wood underneath. One of the legs was slightly shorter than the others, making it tilt at a weird angle. It was an instrument that belonged in a junkyard, not on a stage. They didn't fix the wobble. In fact, they loosened a few more screws on the bench just to be sure it would be uncomfortable. "Perfect," the lead singer whispered, dusting off his hands and looking at their creation with pride. "Let's see her play that." The house lights dimmed, and the chatter in the hall died down. The show began. It was the usual mix of off-key singers and energetic dance troupes. The audience clapped politely, sipped their lukewarm drinks, and waited for the main act, the local band, to close the show. Backstage in the makeshift dressing room, Maria was getting ready. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from a mixture of terror and excitement. She had bought a dress for the occasion. It wasn't new, but it was the best thing she owned. It was a simple blue dress that she had saved up for months to buy at the thrift store. She had taken extra care with her hair, letting it down for once, and she had put on a little bit of lipstick. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror and took a deep breath. She wasn't thinking about being a star. She was thinking about the song her mother used to hum to her when she was a little girl, a melody that had kept her going through the hardest years of her life. She just wanted to play it. She wanted to feel that connection again, just for a few minutes. 5 minutes, Maria, a stagehand called out, sticking his head into the room. He didn't know about the prank. He just looked tired and wanted to get the schedule moving. "Thank you," Maria whispered. She stood up, smoothing down the fabric of her dress. She felt a fluttering in her chest, a nervous energy that made her feel light on her feet. She picked up her small bag and walked toward the curtain. Out in the hall, the host announced her name. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a very special performer, Maria, playing a selection on the piano." There was a smattering of polite applause. Most people looked at their programs or turned to talk to their neighbors. They didn't know who Maria was, and they didn't expect much. The musicians in the wings leaned against the amp stacks, crossing their arms and grinning at each other. They had their phones out, ready to record the disaster they had created. Maria walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit her face, blinding her for a moment. She blinked and stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She was looking down at her feet, making sure she didn't trip, until she reached the center of the stage. She stopped and looked up, expecting to see the glossy, black grand piano she had cleaned and admired for so long. She stopped breathing. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight in front of her. The peeling paint, the tilted leg, the dust that coated the top like gray snow. It wasn't just old, it was destroyed. She stood there for a long moment, confusion washing over her face. She looked back at the wings, hoping for an explanation, but the shadows were deep. She couldn't see the smirking faces of the band members hiding there. The silence in the room stretched out. The audience began to shuffle in their seats, murmuring, wondering what was taking so long. Maria walked slowly to the bench. She reached out and touched the wood. It felt rough and splintery under her fingertips. She sat down slowly. The bench wobbled, making her grab the edge of the keyboard to steady herself. From the darkness of the wings, the guitarist let out a quiet, sharp laugh, thinking she was about to run away crying. But Maria didn't run. She looked at the keys, yellowed and chipped. A wave of realization crashed over her. She saw the dust. She saw the rust. She understood. This wasn't a mistake. She had been handed a joke. She looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces looking back at her, waiting. She thought about the weeks of silent practice, the song in her heart, and the courage it took to even ask for 5 minutes of their time. Her face flushed hot with a sudden spike of humiliation, but underneath that, something else began to burn. She placed her hands over the keys, her fingers trembling just a little. The room was completely silent now, waiting for the first note. The silence in the room was heavy, pressing down on the stage like a thick, wool blanket. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were fixed on the woman in the blue dress. People shifted in their plastic seats, the creaking of chairs echoing in the quiet hall. A few whispered to their neighbors, asking why she wasn't playing. They assumed she was just nervous. After all, most people who got up on stage were terrified. They expected her to freeze, maybe apologize, and then shuffle away in embarrassment. Maria sat on the wobbly bench, her hands hovering just inches above the keys. She wasn't just nervous, she was confused. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was in front of her. She had expected the gleaming black instrument she polished every week, the one that sang with the rich, clear tone. Instead, she was staring at a wreck. The white keys had turned a dingy yellow, and the black keys were chipped, revealing the cheap wood underneath. The music rack was bent, making it look like the piano was grimacing in pain. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the frantic thumping of her heart. She told herself it didn't matter how it looked. She was here to play music. She closed her eyes for a second, visualizing the song she had practiced in her head 1,000 times. It was a slow, gentle piece, full of sadness and hope. She knew exactly where her fingers needed to go. With a trembling hand, she reached out and pressed down the middle C key, intending to start the melody. Instead of a soft, musical note, a sickening thunk rang out. It was the sound of a piece of dead wood hitting a piece of felt. No vibration, no singing string, just a dull, hollow knock. Maria pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. She stared at the key, willing it to work. She pressed it again, harder this time. Thunk. Nothing. A ripple of laughter went through the audience. It started near the back, where a group of teenagers had been bored and restless. It wasn't loud laughter, but it was sharp. It was the sound of people realizing something was going wrong and enjoying the mishap. The laughter spread like a cold wind. A man in the front row coughed loudly to cover a snicker. Maria felt her face grow hot. A flush of red crept up her neck and burned her cheeks. She looked at her hands, rough and red from years of cleaning work, resting on the ugly yellow keys. She felt small. She felt like the little girl who used to stare in the shop window at dolls she couldn't afford. The humiliation was a physical weight on her shoulders, pushing her down. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to run off the stage and out the back exit into the cool night air. She wanted to go back to her small apartment and never come out again. But she didn't move. She sat frozen, her feet resting on the pedals. She tried another key, this time a higher one, hoping the treble side might still be intact. Her finger pushed the key down. It didn't come back up. It stuck halfway, creating a weird, discordant buzzing sound that seemed to hang in the air forever. The laughter got louder. It wasn't just a few people now. The mood in the room had shifted from polite waiting to amusement at her expense. People were pointing. The musicians in the wings were losing their battle to stay quiet. The drummer was shaking with silent laughter, his shoulders bouncing up and down. The lead singer had a hand over his mouth, but his eyes were dancing with cruelty. They saw exactly what they wanted to see, the cleaning lady realizing she didn't belong. Maria looked up from the keyboard and out into the dark room. The spotlight was blinding, making it impossible to see individual faces clearly, but she could feel their judgment. It felt like the air was being sucked out of her lungs. She gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles turned white. This was a joke. It was a cruel, mean-spirited joke played on her by people who thought she was nothing. She thought about her life. She thought about the early mornings scrubbing floors, the backaches, the loneliness. She thought about the way people looked through her, like she was a piece of furniture. Music was the only thing she had that was just hers. It was the one beautiful thing she kept hidden inside, a secret garden she visited in her mind. And now, they had turned that into a punchline. The MC, a tall man in a suit that was slightly too big for him, walked onto the edge of the stage. He held a microphone in one hand and looked at Maria with a mix of pity and annoyance. He leaned in close, intending to whisper to her, but the microphone was still on, and his voice boomed through the hall. "Is there a technical issue, love?" he asked. A few people chuckled. "Maybe we should cut this one short and get the next act on." The audience clapped at the suggestion. They were ready for her to go. They wanted the embarrassment to stop so they could enjoy the rest of the show. Maria looked at the MC. She saw the condescending smile on his face. He wasn't helping her, he was saving the schedule. He didn't care about her or her music. He just wanted to clear the stage. She looked back at the piano. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. She could feel the tears stinging the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over and ruin her makeup. She could feel the breakdown coming. It was right there, clawing at the back of her throat. The urge to sob was overwhelming. If she cried now, they would laugh even harder. They would say, "Look at the old lady, crying over a broken piano." She dropped her hands into her lap. She sat there, hunched over, looking defeated. The laughter in the room started to die down again, turning into an awkward, restless murmur. The MC tapped his foot, waiting for her to stand up so he could escort her away. But Maria didn't stand up. She took a long, shaky breath. She closed her eyes tight and squeezed the tears away. She pictured her mother's face, kind and patient. She remembered the sound of her mother humming while she cooked dinner, a simple song that made their tiny, run-down apartment feel like a palace. That song didn't belong to the people in the audience. It didn't belong to the mean musicians in the shadows. It belonged to her. She wasn't doing this for them. She wasn't doing this to impress the MC or the people who paid $5 for a ticket. She was doing this because she had music inside her that needed to get out. If the piano was broken, she would just have to be better than the piano. She opened her eyes. The tears were gone, replaced by a glistening hardness. Her back straightened. She lifted her chin. She looked at the keyboard again, not with fear, but with a look of challenge. She would not be the joke. She would not be the victim. The MC took a step closer, reaching out a hand to help her up. "Come on now," he said, his voice booming again. "Let's give a big hand for trying." Maria ignored him. She shifted her weight on the bench, ignoring the wobble. She lifted her hands. They weren't trembling anymore. They were steady. She placed her fingers on the keys, but she avoided the ones she knew were dead. She stretched her left hand down toward the bass notes, the heavy low keys that seemed too far away. She arched her right hand up toward the high treble, skipping the broken middle section entirely. The audience went quiet again. They sensed a change in her posture. The MC froze, his hands still out, confused by why she wasn't leaving. The musicians in the wings stopped giggling and leaned forward, watching to see what she would do. She pressed down a chord in the bass. It was low and gritty, a rumble that shook the floorboards. It wasn't a pretty sound, but it was a sound. It was growling and angry. She followed it immediately with two high notes in the treble, sharp and piercing like a cry for help. The contrast between the low growl and the high cry was shocking. It wasn't the song she had planned to play, but it was music. It was raw and it was real. She played the two sounds again, slower this time, letting them hang in the air. The laughter in the hall died completely. The awkwardness was replaced by a strange, electric tension. People sat up in their seats. They realized she wasn't leaving. She was fighting back. She was going to play this broken thing, and she dared them to keep laughing. The master of ceremonies stood awkwardly on the edge of the stage, his hands still hovering in the air. He looked at the audience, then back at the woman sitting at the wrecked instrument. He expected her to crumble. Most people would have run away by now, hiding their face in shame. But Maria just sat there, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the yellowed keys as if they were the only things in the world that mattered. The silence in the hall was different now. It wasn't the polite silence of waiting, it was the confused silence of people who didn't know what was going to happen next. The MC cleared his throat loudly, the sound scratching through the speakers. "All right, folks, technical difficulties," he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He took another step forward, intending to gently guide her off the stage. He wanted to be the hero of the moment, the one who saved the show from the awkwardness. "Let's just move this along," and a low, grinding sound cut him off. Maria had slammed her foot onto the sustain pedal. The metal rod screamed against its rusted housing, making a high-pitched screech that made everyone in the room flinch. It was an ugly, painful noise. But she didn't stop. As the screech faded, she brought her hands down hard on the low end of the keyboard. A deep, muddy rumble shook the floor. It sounded like a stone rolling down a canyon, not a musical note. The MC froze, his mouth half open. He pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. Maria began to play. It wasn't a song the audience recognized. It was jagged and uneven. Because the middle section of the piano was completely dead, she had to invent a new way to play. Her left hand stomped on the heavy bass keys, creating a slow, heartbeat rhythm: thump, thump, pause, thump. Her right hand jumped up to the high notes, playing fast, sharp little runs that sounded like glass breaking. She was fighting the instrument. Every time she pressed a key, she had to use force, as if she was punching the sound out of it. The music wasn't smooth, it was violent. It sounded like a storm trapped inside a box. Near the back of the hall, the musicians who had set up the prank stopped laughing. The drummer lowered his phone, the video forgotten. The lead singer narrowed his eyes, his arms uncrossing as he leaned against the wall. They had expected tears. They had expected her to give up. They didn't expect this. They didn't expect the sheer aggression coming from that small woman in the blue dress. She wasn't apologizing for being there. She was taking the space they tried to ruin and filling it with something they couldn't ignore. The song she was playing began to change shape. It was no longer just noise. There was a pattern to it. The heavy, rumbling bass notes acted like a foundation, and the sharp, high-pitched melodies danced over the top. Because she couldn't play the middle notes to connect them, there was a gap in the sound, a vast emptiness in the middle of the music. But instead of sounding broken, that emptiness made the high notes sound lonely and the low notes sound protective. It sounded like a conversation between two people shouting across a great distance. Maria's face had changed, too. The red flush of embarrassment was gone. Her expression was fierce. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't blink. She stared at the dancing dust motes in the spotlight, completely lost in the world she was creating. She was sweating now, beads of perspiration gathered on her forehead. Her fingers were moving faster, slamming into the keys that worked and avoiding the ones that didn't. The audience was paralyzed. Nobody looked at their phones anymore. Nobody whispered to their neighbor. 400 people held their breath, captivated by the struggle playing out in front of them. It wasn't just a performance, it was a battle. They could feel the effort in every note. They could hear the metal strings rattling against the cast iron plate, the wood groaning under the pressure. It was raw. It was unpolished. And it was absolutely human. Suddenly, Maria hit a chord in the bass that made the whole piano shudder. One of the pedals fell off with a loud clang, hitting the floor and rolling away. The sound startled everyone, but Maria didn't even flinch. She didn't miss a beat. She simply adjusted her foot, playing without the pedal now, forcing her fingers to work harder to sustain the notes. That was the moment the mood in the room shifted completely. The cruelty evaporated, replaced by a grudging respect. You cannot mock someone who refuses to be mocked. You cannot laugh at someone who is stronger than the instrument designed to humiliate them. The pranksters in the wings looked at each other, their smiles gone. The joke wasn't funny anymore. The punchline had walked off the stage, leaving only the truth. The music grew quieter. Maria slowed the rhythm down. The heavy bass notes became soft, like a mother's heartbeat. The high notes became gentle, like rain on a roof, but without the water. It was a lullaby for a broken world. She was using the ugly sounds to make something beautiful. She was taking the rust and the dust and the silence and weaving them into a story that everyone understood, the story of keeping going even when everything is falling apart. A young girl in the front row, no older than 7, leaned forward over the metal barrier. She was holding her father's hand, but she wasn't looking at him. She was watching Maria's hands. She saw the calluses on the woman's fingers, the way her wrists moved with a fluid grace that contradicted the harsh sounds coming from the piano. The girl didn't know about music theory or the history of the song. She only knew that the music made her feel something deep in her chest, a feeling she had never felt before. It felt like bravery. The MC had retreated completely into the shadows. He stood near the curtain, watching with his mouth shut. He realized that if he tried to stop her now, the crowd would turn on him. The power in the room had shifted. It was no longer with the people holding the microphones or the instruments. It was with the woman playing the wreck. Maria played on, oblivious to the change in the atmosphere. She was no longer in the hall. She was back in her memory, playing for her mother. She was playing for every time she had been overlooked, every time she had been told to be quiet, every time she had cleaned up a mess she didn't make. The music was her voice, finally loud enough to be heard. She struck the final low note, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to hang in the air forever. She lifted her hands high above the keyboard, her fingers spread wide. The note faded slowly, decaying into the dusty rafters, leaving the room in a state of absolute, breathless suspension. The last sound that was heard was the sharp intake of breath from 400 people, all at the same time. Maria lowered her hands to her lap. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, waiting for the silence to break. The silence that followed the final note was not the silence of an empty room, it was a heavy, thick, living thing. It pressed against the walls of the hall, filling every corner, every crack, and every mind present. No one moved. No one spoke. The air seemed to vibrate with the ghost of the sound that had just died away. Usually, at the end of a performance, there is a moment of noise, people coughing, unwrapping candy, shuffling their feet. But tonight, there was none of that. It was as if the entire audience had forgotten how to be human for a few seconds. They were just statues in the dim light, struck dumb by the raw honesty of what they had witnessed. Maria sat on the bench, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Her chest was heaving slightly, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The physical effort of playing such a broken instrument had taken a toll on her. Her shoulders ached, and her fingers felt stiff and swollen. But she didn't move to stand up. She just sat there, her head bowed, staring at the ruined keys. She felt empty, drained in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. She had poured everything she had into the music, leaving nothing behind. She felt light, like a balloon with its string cut, floating in the bright spotlight. Out in the darkness of the hall, people were exchanging glances, but they weren't glances of amusement anymore. The cruelty that had hung in the air like a bad smell earlier had completely vanished. In its place was a profound sense of shame. The man in the third row who had laughed the loudest looked down at his shoes, his face burning hot. He realized now that he hadn't been laughing at a bad performance, he had been laughing at a brave soul. And that realization tasted bitter in his mouth. A young woman near the front, who had been checking her phone boredly when Maria walked out, was now frozen with her hand over her mouth. Tears were welling in her eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks without her even noticing. She didn't know why she was crying. The music wasn't conventionally pretty. It was jagged and rough. But it felt true. It felt like the sound of her own struggles, of her own bad days, and her own desperate attempts to keep going when things were broken. She saw herself in that broken piano, and she saw Maria's strength in the way the woman played it. It was the most real thing she had ever experienced. In the wings, the mood had turned from gloating to horror. The four musicians stood frozen, their earlier confidence evaporated. The drummer was staring at his hands, unable to look at the stage. The bass player had her arms wrapped tightly around herself, suddenly feeling cold. They had set out to make a fool of Maria, but the only fools in the room now were them. They had used their talent to be cruel, and she had used her struggle to create art. The contrast was painful. They felt small, petty, and insignificant. The prank had backfired in the worst way possible. It hadn't humiliated her, it had revealed their own ugliness to everyone. The master of ceremonies stood near the curtain, his face pale. He looked out at the audience, realizing that he couldn't just walk out there and make a joke. He couldn't treat this like a regular intermission. He felt it too, that strange, electric energy that was coming from the stage. He realized that this wasn't just a talent show act anymore. This was a moment of human connection that was rare and precious. Then, a single sound broke the silence. It was the sound of a chair squeaking near the front row. An elderly man slowly stood up. He was thin and frail, leaning heavily on a cane. His hair was white as snow, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles that told the story of a long, hard life. He had seen a lot in his years, enough to know the difference between a joke and the truth. He gazed up at the stage with cloudy eyes that were suddenly bright with tears. He didn't clap. He didn't cheer. He just stood there in silence, looking at Maria with a look of profound respect. He was honoring her not because she was a virtuoso, but because she was a human being who had refused to be beaten. Like a wave rippling across a pond, others began to stand. A mother in the fifth row stood up, pulling her teenage son up with her. A couple in the back stood, holding hands. One by one, people all over the hall rose to their feet. It wasn't a rush. It was slow and deliberate. It was the physical act of saying, "We see you. We hear you. And you are amazing." Then, the applause started. It didn't begin as a polite clapping. It began as a roar. It started as a few people clapping their hands together hard, and then grew, spreading through the room until it sounded like thunder rolling through the building. It wasn't just applause, it was a release. It was the sound of 400 people apologizing for their doubts, for their laughter, and for their judgment. It was deafening. The walls shook with the sound. The floorboards vibrated. Maria flinched slightly as the sound hit her. She wasn't used to noise being directed at her in kindness. She slowly lifted her head and looked out into the glare of the lights. She couldn't see individual faces clearly because of the spotlight, but she could see the shapes. She could see the dark silhouettes of the audience standing. She could feel the energy rushing toward her like a warm wind. She blinked, confused for a moment. She expected them to be booing. She expected them to be throwing things or yelling at her to get off the stage. But they weren't. They were standing. They were cheering. She saw the elderly man in the front row, a tiny silhouette against the brightness, slowly raising a trembling hand to wave. He was smiling. That was what broke through her shell. A small, surprised smile touched her lips, transforming her face. She didn't look like the cleaning lady anymore. She didn't look like the victim of a prank. She looked like a queen on her throne. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak, but they held her. She smoothed down the front of her blue dress, a habit from years of trying to look neat and invisible. But she wasn't invisible now. She was the only thing they could see. She looked toward the side of the stage where the musicians were hiding. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there. She hoped they were watching. She hoped they understood that you can't break a person just by giving them a broken tool. If the person is strong enough, they will use that tool to build something new. Maria gave a small, shy nod to the audience. It wasn't a bow. She didn't know how to bow like a fancy performer. She just nodded, a simple gesture of gratitude. It said, "Thank you for letting me be me." The applause grew even louder, if that was possible. People were shouting bravo. An encore. The MC had to cover his ears because the sound was so overwhelming. He looked at Maria, waiting for a cue. Should he bring her back? Should he let her play again? But Maria shook her head slightly. She was done. She had said everything she needed to say. She turned away from the audience and looked at the broken piano one last time. She reached out and patted the dusty top of it gently, like a mother comforting a sick child. It wasn't the piano's fault it was broken. And it wasn't her fault that people tried to use it against her. Together, they had made something beautiful. She turned and began to walk toward the side of the stage. With every step she took, the lights seemed to follow her, illuminating her path. She didn't scurry away in shame. She walked with her head high, her steps slow and measured. She walked through the curtain, leaving the roaring crowd behind her, stepping out of the light and back into the shadows of the wings, a changed woman. Maria stepped through the heavy velvet curtains and into the darkness of the wings. The roaring sound of the applause was instantly cut off, replaced by the muffled, distant echo of a crowd that wouldn't stop cheering. It felt like stepping from a storm into a quiet cave. The air backstage was cool and smelled of dust and old electrical cables. Her heart was still pounding against her ribs, a frantic drum beat that made her feel dizzy. She leaned against the brick wall, closing her eyes for a moment to steady herself. She could feel the adrenaline rushing out of her system, leaving her limbs feeling heavy and shaky. She had done it. She had actually done it. For years, she had been the invisible woman, the one who moved chairs and swept floors while the important people took the stage. Tonight, for the first time in her life, she had been the one they looked at. She had been the one they listened to. Slowly, She opened her eyes and looked around. The shadows of the wings seemed longer and darker than usual. That was when she realized she wasn't alone. Standing a few feet away, pressed against the black boxes of lighting equipment, were the four musicians. They didn't look like the confident, cool group that had been laughing earlier. The drummer was looking at the floor, kicking aimlessly at a cable. The bass player was picking at her fingernails, her face red. The lead singer and the guitarist were leaning against the wall, their arms crossed tight over their chests, refusing to make eye contact. The silence between them was thick and suffocating. It was the silence of guilt. They had heard the applause. They had felt the change in the room. They knew that their prank had failed completely. They hadn't humiliated her, they had given her the biggest moment of her life. And now, standing in the shadows, they looked small. They looked like children who had been caught doing something mean and didn't know how to apologize. Maria looked at them for a long moment. She saw the expensive instruments leaning against the amps, the flashy clothes, the arrogant posture that was now crumbling. She thought about how easy it would be to yell at them. She could scream at them for being cruel, for making her feel small, for trying to break her spirit. A part of her wanted to. She wanted to tell them that talent wasn't about the gear you owned or the clothes you wore, it was about what you had inside you. But as she looked at their lowered heads, she realized something. Yelling at them wouldn't fix anything. Anger would just keep her tied to them. She didn't want their anger, and she didn't need their apology. She had found something tonight that was stronger than their cruelty. She had found her own voice. She didn't say a word. She didn't glare at them, and she didn't smile. She simply adjusted the strap of her small bag on her shoulder and stood up straight. She brushed a stray hair away from her face with a calm, deliberate motion. She treated them exactly the way they used to treat her, like she didn't even notice they were there. She walked past them, her steps soft on the concrete floor, moving toward the exit. As she passed, the guitarist shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if he wanted to say something. But he didn't. The words stuck in his throat. He just watched her go, feeling a knot of shame tighten in his stomach that he knew wouldn't go away for a long time. Maria pushed through the metal exit door at the back of the hallway and stepped out into the night. The air outside was crisp and cold, biting at her cheeks. It felt refreshing after the stuffy heat of the hall. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by a single orange street lamp that buzzed softly. A few cars were driving by on the main road, their headlights cutting through the darkness. She walked toward her old sedan, which was parked in the far corner under a tree. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she unlocked the car door and slid into the driver's seat. She sat there for a long time, leaving the engine off. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself to keep out the chill. She looked at her hands resting on the steering wheel. They were the same hands she had always had, rough, work-worn, the knuckles a bit swollen. But to her, they looked different now. They didn't look like just cleaning hands anymore. They looked like artists' hands. They had pulled beauty out of a broken box. They had made 400 people stand up and feel something real. From inside the car, she could hear the faint sound of the next act starting on stage inside the building. It was a loud, energetic rock band. They were probably good. They probably played all the right notes on their expensive, well-tuned guitars. But Maria knew something they didn't. She knew that perfection isn't what moves people. Connection moves people. Truth moves people. Being willing to be broken, and letting people see it, that is what makes us human. A small smile played on her lips. It wasn't a happy smile, and it wasn't a sad smile. It was a peaceful smile. She realized she didn't need to be a famous musician. She didn't need to quit her job or move to a big city. She just needed to know that she could do it. She had faced a room full of people who wanted to laugh at her, and she had won them over without saying a single word. That was a power nobody could take away from her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small tissue to wipe her eyes. She wasn't crying because she was sad, and she wasn't crying because she was happy. She was crying because she felt cleansed. She had poured the poison out and replaced it with music. She started the engine. The car sputtered and coughed before settling into a steady rumble, much like the piano she had just played. She put the car in gear and drove out of the parking lot. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need any music. She just listened to the hum of the engine and the sound of her own breathing. As she drove down the empty streets of the town, passing the closed shops and the dark windows of the houses, she thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow, she would go back to the rehearsal hall. She would pick up the mop and the bucket. She would clean the floors. The musicians would probably be there, practicing their songs. They might look at her differently now. They might be polite, or they might ignore her even harder to hide their embarrassment. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Maria turned a corner, her headlights sweeping over the familiar road. She knew she would never play that broken piano again. It would probably go back to the storage room to gather dust, or maybe they would just throw it away. But that was okay. It had served its purpose. It was just wood and wire. The music wasn't in the piano. The music had never been in the piano. The music was in her. It had been there all along, waiting for her to be brave enough to let it out. She drove on into the night, no longer the invisible cleaning lady, but a woman who carried her own song, safe and warm, inside her heart. The street lights flashed over her face one by one, illuminating a woman who finally knew exactly who she was. And that was enough.